There is a stretch of highway south of Gainesville where the trees suddenly fall away and Florida opens into something enormous. A vast prairie spreads toward the horizon beneath a sky that seems almost too large for the state around it. We had driven across Paynes Prairie several times on other trips. We had even stopped at the observation area along the highway on our way home from Milledgeville. But until that trip, I thought we had already seen the park. We had not. Because beyond the highway is a landscape where wild horses and bison still roam, where a lake once appeared and swallowed the prairie for nearly 20 years, and where some of Florida's earliest cattlemen built powerful communities long before cowboys became symbols of the American West. And somehow, despite all of that history waiting just beyond the road, the thing that finally convinced us to stop was learning there was a visitor center, an observation tower, and gift shop pins. We are nothing if not consistent. This is Paynes Prairie Preserve State Park, and its story is much bigger than the view from the highway. Paynes Prairie lies in a broad basin created by Florida's restless limestone geology. Water flows into the prairie from the surrounding landscape, but instead of leaving through an ordinary river, much of it drains underground through Alachua Sink and into the Florida Aquifer. At least, that is what happens when the sink is open. When vegetation, sediment, or debris obstructs it, the prairie begins filling with water. That means Paynes Prairie has never been entirely one thing. Sometimes it is open grassland. Sometimes it's marsh. And sometimes the prairie becomes a lake. That constant movement between wet and dry created a remarkably diverse landscape, one that supported indigenous communities for thousands of years before European colonization reached Florida. The prairie offered water, wildlife, fertile ground, and natural travel routes through north-central Florida. But it was never an empty wilderness waiting to be discovered. It was already known, already used, already home. And when Europeans arrived, they recognized that the land could support something else in enormous numbers: cattle. During the Spanish colonial period, cattle ranching became one of the most important industries in Florida's interior. By the 1600s, a major ranch known as La Chua had developed near the prairie. Spanish cattle were well suited to Florida's heat, insects, and difficult terrain. Over generations, those hardy animals helped form the bloodlines associated with what we now call Florida cracker cattle. The ranch supplied meat, leather, and other goods to settlements including St. Augustine. And the people managing those herds were riding horses, working livestock, and driving cattle across Florida generations before the great cattle drives of the American West. Florida rarely gets invited into the cowboy conversation. Apparently, we forgot to wear the correct hat. But cattle ranching here predates many of the traditions later made famous in Texas and the Western Territories. The Spanish ranching system eventually collapsed as Florida became caught between competing colonial powers and increasingly violent raids. La Chua was abandoned during the early 1700s. The ranch may have disappeared, but many of its cattle remained. They scattered across the prairie, multiplied, and became one of the foundations for the next great chapter in this landscape. During the 1700s, groups of indigenous people migrated south into Florida from areas including Georgia and Alabama. Among their leaders was an Oconee man known as Ahaya. The English called him the Cowkeeper, a name tied to the large herds his people controlled around the Alachua Savannah. Cowkeeper established a powerful community called Cuskawilla near the prairie. The cattle grazing here were more than livestock. They provided food, wealth, and trading power. They also helped Cowkeeper's people build a degree of independence in a Florida being contested by the Spanish, British, and eventually the Americans. When naturalist William Bartram visited the area in 1774, he called it the Great Alachua Savanna and described a landscape filled with wildlife and grazing cattle. The scene must have looked almost impossibly vast. But this was not an untouched paradise. It was the center of a thriving indigenous cattle culture. After Cowkeeper's death, leadership passed to his son, Payne. Often called King Payne in historical records, he became an influential leader among the Alachua Seminoles. His people established settlements near the prairie, raised cattle, and navigated an increasingly dangerous political world as American settlers and military forces pressed into Spanish Florida. The prairie eventually took Payne's name, but that carries the memory of a community that was about to be attacked, displaced, and nearly erased from the landscape it had helped shape. In 1812, armed forces from Georgia entered Spanish Florida as part of an attempted invasion, sometimes called the Patriot War. The Alachua Seminoles became caught in the conflict. During fighting near the prairie, Payne was mortally wounded. He died soon afterward. American troops later returned, attacking and destroying Seminole settlements in the region. These battles foreshadowed the larger Seminole Wars that would engulf Florida over the following decades. The conflicts were not simply military campaigns over territory. They were struggles over homes, cattle, trade routes, political independence, and the future of Florida itself. As American control expanded, many Seminole communities were driven southward or forcibly removed from the territory. The cattle kingdom that had once flourished around the prairie was broken apart. But Paynes Prairie continued doing what it had always done. It changed. And this time, it transformed so dramatically that people began crossing it by boat. During the 1870s, Alachua Sink became obstructed and water began collecting across the basin. By 1871, much of the prairie had disappeared beneath what became known as Alachua Lake. For roughly 20 years, boats crossed water where cattle and bison had once grazed. Historical accounts describe paddle-driven vessels and small steamboats carrying passengers, agricultural goods, and other cargo across the lake. Just imagine that for a moment. Today you can stand in the observation tower looking across grassland and marsh, but during the late 1800s, you might have watched a boat moving across the same horizon. Then, around 1891, the blockage at Alachua Sink cleared, the water drained, the lake receded, and the prairie returned. Paynes Prairie still floods today because its water level remains closely tied to rainfall and the condition of the sink. It is not a landscape frozen in time. It breathes, it fills, it empties, it repeatedly rewrites itself. By the early 1900s, ranchers and landowners were no longer willing to let the prairie follow its own rhythm. Canals and drainage systems were constructed to control the water and make more of the land available for grazing and agriculture. But altering the prairie's natural flow affected its wetlands, wildlife habitats, and plant communities. The landscape was still vast, still beautiful, but its wild systems were being steadily reshaped for human use. For decades, that was the familiar story of Florida. Wetlands were drained, rivers were redirected, wildlife disappeared, and places that had survived centuries of conflict were often transformed in only a few generations. Then Florida did something remarkable. It decided to preserve the prairie. The The state of Florida began acquiring Paynes Prairie in 1970. The following year, it became Florida's first officially designated state preserve, a classification intended to protect not only its recreational value, but its biological, geological, and historical importance. In 1974, Paynes Prairie was also designated a National Natural Landmark. Restoration efforts began repairing some of the damage created by earlier drainage projects. Managers worked to restore natural water movement, protect native habitats, and preserve the prairie as a functioning ecosystem. But restoring Paynes Prairie also meant returning animals that had vanished from the Florida landscape. American bison were reintroduced during the 1970s. Florida cracker horses followed in the 1980s. Today, Paynes Prairie is the only Florida state park where visitors may encounter both wild roaming bison and horses. Nearly 300 species of birds also use the preserve, alongside alligators, deer, bobcats, and countless smaller creatures that are considerably less famous but probably resent the unequal publicity. And because we had already seen bison, wild horses, and alligators elsewhere, I honestly was not sure how impressed I would be. Apparently, the prairie heard that and took it personally. Paynes Prairie was the first planned stop of our trip. We had passed through it several times before, and during our return from Milledgeville, we had stopped at the roadside observation area. But after getting home, I learned that the main park entrance had a visitor center and a 50-foot observation tower. I also learned about the bison and wild horses. So naturally, we had to return. Not necessarily for the trails. Let us remain reasonable. We parked and followed a short boardwalk toward the visitor center. Inside, an enormous window faced the prairie, with viewing scopes positioned so visitors could search the landscape for wildlife. And almost immediately, we spotted wild horses. Then we found a bison. They were far away, little moving shapes against the grass, but there they were. Not behind fences, not inside an exhibit, just roaming across the same prairie where generations of people had raised cattle, fought for their homes, and watched the water rise and fall. That was much cooler than I expected. We also bought our park pens and magnet, thereby completing the traditional travel-made personal ritual, history, wildlife, gift shop. Civilizations remain intact. After leaving the visitor center, we returned to the truck for my larger camera lens and headed toward the observation tower. The park's tower rises about 50 feet above the southern rim of the prairie, providing a broad view across the preserve. To reach the top, however, we first had to climb 3 levels of wooden staircases. Apparently, Florida's wild horses do not provide elevator service. But once we reached the top, the view opened in every direction. From there, you could begin to understand just how enormous the prairie really is. The animals were still too far away for the photographs I had imagined. Even with the big lens, the horses and bison looked more like evidence than portraits. But the photographs were almost beside the point. The tower gave us something the highway never could: perspective. From the road, Paynes Prairie is scenery passing outside a window. From the tower, it becomes a world. Paynes Prairie Preserve State Park surprised me. I went because we were already traveling through the area. I wanted to see the visitor center, climb the tower, and maybe find the animals. Instead, we found a landscape holding thousands of years of human history. Spanish ranchers raised cattle here. Some of Florida's earliest cowboys worked these lands. Cowkeeper and Payne built a powerful Seminole cattle culture around the prairie. American forces invaded it. A lake swallowed it. Boats crossed it. Canals drained it. And eventually, Florida chose to protect it. Today, wild horses and bison once again move across the grasslands. The water continues to rise and fall, and the prairie remains exactly what it has always been: unpredictable, restless, alive. We had driven across Paynes Prairie several times thinking we had seen it. But sometimes the real story is not beside the road. It is waiting just beyond it, past the boardwalk, inside a visitor center, and occasionally at the top of 3 flights of stairs. This is Travel Made Personal. I'm Key, and sometimes taking the long way through Florida begins with finally stopping at the place you have been passing all along.